The wind came first low and dragging across the land like a wounded animal, carrying the cold breath of winter from the mountains. Elias Carter heard it pressing against the cabin walls, rattling the loose shingles, sighing through the chimney's throat. He sat at the table with a tin mug of black coffee cooling before him, the lamp flame trembling as if afraid. Outside, the world was colorless, just dust and frost. The faint line of the cottonwoods ghosting along the creek bed dotted it had been 7 winters since he last shared the cabin with another voice. 7 since cholera had taken his wife and the unborn child she carried. In the beginning, silence had been unbearable. Now it was the only companion he trusted. He'd grown used to the rhythm of solitude, the scrape of a chair, the creak of the porch step, the whisper of a match catching against kindling. A man who outlasts his family learns to live like the land dry. Enduring, wordless, that night as he reached to refill his mug, a faint sound broke through the wind. A knock, once then again, softer. Elias froze. Visitors didn't come this far out, not in winter, not at night. His hand went instinctively to the rifle leaning near the door. He waited, breath held. The knock came a third time, hesitant, pleading dot when he opened the door. The lantern light spilled across a shape in the snow. A woman. She stood barefoot, wrapped in what was left of a cloth dress, torn and stiff with mud. Her dark hair hung in uneven braids, and her skin bronze beneath the frost shivered with exhaustion. Her eyes, wide and hollow, searched his face with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. For a long moment neither spoke. Elias could hear the wind scraping against her bones. He saw the bruises on her shoulder, the cracked skin on her feet. Apache, he thought. He had seen women like her before years ago, when soldiers brought captives through the valley. But never this close. Never like this. He felt his pulse tighten. Bringing her inside meant questions, danger, gossip that would spread like fire through dry grass. The town already called him strange, said solitude had made him soft in the head. An Apache woman beneath his roof would be a scandal, maybe even a death sentence for them both. Still, something in her eyes stopped him from closing the door. There was defiance there, yes, but beneath it, the same fragile terror he'd seen in his wife's eyes the day the fever took hold. A human cry that reached deeper than language. Elias lowered the rifle. "Come in," he said quietly. The woman hesitated, then stepped inside. Her body trembled as the warm air touched her skin. Elias shut the door against the storm and gestured toward the hearth. The fire there had dwindled to a few red embers, but he knelt and stirred it back to life, feeding it with dry pine until the flames rose. Licking at the shadows, she crouched close to the heat. Holding her hands out, her lips parted in a soft breath of relief. Steam lifted from her hair as the frost melted. Elias poured what was left of his coffee into a clean tin cup and handed it to her. She took it with both hands, sniffed cautiously, then drank. He watched her throat move, saw the tremor in her fingers. When she finished, she whispered a word that sounded like thanks. Though he couldn't be sure, he fetched one of his wife's old blankets from the trunk by the bed, faded quilt she had sewn before the sickness. He paused a moment, fingers brushing the worn fabric, then carried it to the woman. She accepted it, wrapping it around her shoulders. "What's your name?" he asked. She looked at him for a moment, uncertain if she should answer. Then, in a soft broken accent, she said, "Nayeli." Her voice was little more than a breath, but it settled in the room like a memory strange and familiar all at once. Elias nodded. "I'm Elias." She didn't repeat it. Instead, she lay down near the hearth, curling beneath the blanket. Her eyes stayed open for a while, reflecting the firelight before they closed. Her breathing slowed, uneven at first, then deep and steady. Elias remained where he stood, unsure what to do with his hands, his thoughts. The cabin felt smaller now, as if her presence had shifted the walls closer. The air carried a faint scent, smoke, rain, and something wild, like crushed sage. He sat back at the table and stared at the flames dancing over the logs. His mind drifted to Mary, his wife. He had buried her up on the ridge, where the wind could find her easily. Some nights he still spoke to her, not in words but in thought, asking forgiveness for living when she hadn't. The sight of the Apache woman stirred that ache again. Not with guilt this time, but with something gentler. Outside, the storm thickened. Snow falling in soft spirals against the window pane. The world was locked in silence. Elias listened to the rhythm of Nayeli's breathing, the slow crackle of wood, the whisper of wind around the eaves. For the first time in years, the loneliness did not feel endless. He thought of what the town would say if they knew how they'd call him foolish or worse. He imagined the sheriff's knock, the sneers at the saloon. But for now, there was only the fire, the sleeping stranger, and the sound of snow covering the world. He set another log on the hearth and stayed awake long after midnight, staring into the orange glow. There was something in that light he hadn't felt in a long while, something small but alive, like the first green blade pushing through winter soil when the fire burned low. He rose and draped his coat gently over the sleeping woman. She stirred but did not wake. "Rest," he murmured. Though she could not hear him, Elias returned to his chair, watching the last embers fade to red. The land outside was frozen solid, but somewhere inside, a thaw had begun, emotional tone and realization, quiet mercy and hesitant compassion. The frozen loneliness in both begins to thaw. A man who had closed his heart to the world makes a silent act of grace, a single night of warmth. That will change everything to come. The dawn came pale and brittle, brushing the horizon with a faint streak of gold. Frost clung to the window glass, and the desert beyond looked ghostly silent but watchful. Elias Carter rose from his chair, the ache in his back sharp as ever. The embers in the hearth still glowed, faint and red. On the rug near the fire, Nayeli slept, the blanket drawn up to her chin, her dark hair loose now, spilling over the quilt like ink. He studied her quietly, unsure what to make of this new presence in his house. She was younger than he'd thought, perhaps no more than 20. There were scars on her arms, thin white lines that told stories of hardship and survival. Her feet, still blistered from travel, rested near the warmth of the fire. She slept without fear, though the world had given her every reason to expect it. When she stirred, her eyes opened with a quick flicker, as though ready to flee. Elias stepped back, raising his hand slightly, wordlessly assuring her there was no danger. He poured water into the tin basin near the door and set a piece of cornbread on the table. She rose slowly, wrapping the blanket tighter around her shoulders, her steps quiet but sure. The light through the window caught the curve of her cheek, the faint bruise near her jawline. She did not ask where she was or what he intended. She only looked around the cabin as though mapping it, measuring its safety. Her gaze lingered on the rifle above the mantel, on the cracked mirror beside the door, and finally, on a folded dress of pale cotton resting atop a cedar chest. It was Mary's dress, his wife's, once. Now faded with time, the lace yellowed by dust. Elias followed her eyes to it and felt a sting in his chest. He'd meant to pack it away years ago, but never did. Something had kept him from it, the same something that kept him tethered to the past like a mule to a post. Nayeli said nothing. She did not reach for the dress, nor the photograph resting beside it, but her expression softened, a kind of reverence passing over her face. Outside, the morning stretched thin. Elias took his coat and stepped out to mend the fence along the east pasture. He could see his breath in the cold air, each puff a small ghost vanishing into the wind. From the porch, Nayeli watched him for a while. When he glanced back, she was standing in the doorway, the blanket still around her shoulders, her bare feet against the threshold. She looked out toward the land as though it were both familiar and strange. By midday, he returned to find the cabin tidied, the dishes washed, the woodpiles stacked near the hearth. Nayeli moved with quiet precision, her gestures deliberate but gentle. She seemed to understand what needed doing without being told. When he tried to thank her, she only inclined her head slightly, her eyes unreadable. It was late afternoon when he finally spoke again. "Where were you headed?" he asked, voice low. Nayeli hesitated, glancing toward the open door. The wind outside had changed, bringing a smell that didn't belong, smoke, faint but sharp, drifting from the east. She pointed toward the horizon and said only, "Bad men." "Soldiers." Her English was broken, but her meaning was clear enough. Elias's jaw tightened. He had seen soldiers ride that way before years ago, when they came to round up tribes from the river valley. He remembered the fear, the confusion, the cries that echoed through the canyons. He had stood at a distance, rifle in hand, watching the blue coats drag families from their camps. He'd done nothing. He told himself then that it wasn't his fight, that a man could only save what was his. But the memory had never let him go. It lived behind his ribs like a hidden thorn, small but festering. Nayeli sat by the window now, staring at the rising column of smoke in the far distance. She did not weep. Her face was still, carved by years beyond her age. That night, the wind grew restless again. Elias couldn't shake the unease that settled over him. He loaded his rifle and set it by the door. When the dogs began barking from the ridge, he stepped outside, lantern in hand. In the distance, faint shapes moved against the moonlight riders. Maybe settlers. Maybe soldiers. Maybe worse. He returned quickly and motioned for Nayeli to follow him to the barn. She didn't question it. He cleared a space among the hay bales and pointed. "Stay here," he whispered. "Don't make a sound." She obeyed without argument, crouching low. The fear in her eyes was not wild panic, it was practiced, worn in. She had hidden before. Elias returned to the cabin, heart pounding. The hoofbeats grew louder, then faded toward the north road. Only after the sound vanished did he allow himself to breathe. He leaned against the doorframe, sweat cold on his brow despite the chill. The storm of memory swept through him, faces, shouts. The look of helplessness he'd turned away from once before. He hated that he'd hidden her. The act felt cowardly, yet the fear was real. The world out here had no patience for mercy. No room for blurred lines between the good and the wild. When the danger passed, he went to the barn and found her still waiting, crouched in the straw, the blanket drawn around her shoulders. She looked up when he entered. He wanted to tell her it was safe now, but the words stuck. Instead, he nodded toward the house. She followed him quietly, her steps soft as falling ash. Back inside, the fire was dying again. Nayeli's gaze wandered to the photograph on the mantel, a young woman in a simple dress. Eyes bright, mouth curved in a half-smile. Merry, the air seemed to tighten as she looked at it. Then, gently, she touched the edge of the frame with her fingertips. She kind. "Like you," she said softly. Elias felt the breath leave his chest. The sound of her voice, the simplicity of her words, it was too much. He turned away, pretending to stir the fire. But his hands trembled. He didn't feel kind. He felt like a man drowning in ghosts. When he finally looked back, Nayeli had returned to her place near the hearth. She sat quietly, the flames painting her face with gold and shadow. Elias sat across from her, his heart heavy yet strangely lighter than before. Outside, the smoke had vanished from the sky, but its scent lingered. And with it came a truth Elias could no longer ignore. He hadn't brought her in just to save her. He had done it to save what little of himself remained unspoiled, emotional tone and realization, haunting introspection. The past presses against the present like cold glass. Elias begins to see that compassion alone cannot erase guilt, that mercy, given freely, is not charity but penance. The rain came without warning, rolling over the plains like a gray tide swallowing the light. Elias Carter was stacking the last of the firewood when the wind rose and carried with it a smell of wet earth and distance. He looked up at the sky-black clouds boiling over the hills, heavy with thunder. Within moments the first drops fell. Sharp as pebbles against his skin, he called to the horses and hurried them into the lean-to. The animals whinnied, restless, their eyes wide with the coming storm. Nayeli appeared at the door, her hair whipping around her face, the old blanket tied across her shoulders. She didn't wait for instruction, just ran to help, pulling the gate shut and tying the latch against the wind. Together they worked in silence, their movements rough but sure, like two people long used to survival. By the time they stumbled back to the cabin, the rain was falling in sheets. Elias pushed the door shut and dropped the iron bar across it. The sound of the storm filled the small room, a roaring ocean pressing against thin walls. Thunder cracked, shaking dust from the rafters. Nayeli stood near the fire, dripping, breathing hard. Elias took his wife's old shawl from the peg by the door and handed it to her. It was wool, frayed but warm, the color of sand at dusk. She hesitated before taking it, her fingers brushing his hand just long enough for warmth to pass between them. "Thank you," she murmured. Dodi nodded, his throat dry. "Keep close to the fire." Lightning flashed through the window, and for an instant her face was illuminated, solemn, beautiful, lined with the shadows of everything she'd endured. She spread the shawl over her shoulders and sank to the floor beside the hearth, curling her legs beneath her. Elias poured water from the kettle, the steam rising like smoke, then sat across from her. The fire's glow trembled between them, painting their faces with amber light. For a long while, only the rain spoke. It hammered the roof, hissed against the window, whispered through the cracks in the door. Then Nayeli began to speak. Her words were halting, broken, shaped by a tongue that struggled with English but carried deep meaning nonetheless. She spoke of soldiers, of fire in the night, of her brothers running through the brush with rifles that could not match the army's thunder. She told of a river she'd crossed alone, of days without food, of villages burned to nothing but ash. Her eyes did not fill with tears. The pain had gone too deep for that. Elias listened, jaw tight. He said nothing, though his heart pounded against his ribs like something trying to escape. Her voice reminded him of nights long past when his wife Mary had whispered her fears during the fever, when he promised her they'd see another spring. He had failed her, and that failure had hollowed him. Now, hearing this woman's story, he felt that same helpless ache rise again. When she finished, silence returned, thick as smoke. The storm outside raged harder, lightning striking so near that the cabin shuddered. Elias stood and checked the window shutters. "It'll pass by morning," he said, though he wasn't sure he believed it. Nayeli looked up at him. "You lose someone?" she asked quietly. Elias hesitated. He could have lied or said nothing at all. But the storm had a way of peeling the truth from a man. "My wife?" he said. "Fever took her. Years ago." Nayeli's gaze softened. "You love her still?" "I reckon I do," he said after a pause. "Some loves don't die easy." A low rumble of thunder filled the silence that followed. Elias sat again, the fire's warmth brushing against his hands. For a while, neither spoke. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth and pine smoke, of something raw and human that neither could name. Then, without warning, a lightning strike hit close, so close that the flash blinded them and the sound followed like the world cracking open. The horses screamed in the lean-to and the cabin quaked. Elias lunged forward, instinct driving him. He pulled Nayeli close as debris rattled from the ceiling. Her small frame trembled against his chest. The shawl slipped to the floor, and for a heartbeat, his arms held her as though holding on to the living itself. The thunder rolled away, leaving them in silence but for the rain. He could feel her heartbeat against his own, fast, desperate, real. When she finally looked up, their faces were inches apart, breath mingling, the fire painting gold on her cheeks. Neither moved for a long time. Then Elias cleared his throat, stepping back awkwardly, shame and longing fighting inside him. "Didn't mean to startle you," he muttered. "Nay, I shook her head. "You saved me," she said softly. He turned toward the window, watching the rain beat against the glass. "Just the storm," he said, though they both knew it wasn't true. Hours passed. The storm raged, then softened, the thunder rolling farther and farther until only the steady rhythm of rain remained. Nayeli dozed near the fire, the shawl wrapped tight again, her breathing even. Elias stayed awake, staring into the flames. Every crack of wood was a memory, every flicker of light a reminder of what had been lost and what might yet be found. When dawn came, it was slow and gray. The storm had passed, leaving the land washed clean, raw with new silence. Elias stepped outside, boots sinking into the wet earth. The air smelled of sage and rain. Behind the barn he saw something that made his stomach tighten. Footprints, half filled with water leading toward the ridge. He crouched, touching one print, fresh. Not his. Not Nayeli's rider's, maybe. Searching, he turned toward the cabin where smoke still rose gently from the chimney. Inside, Nayeli was stirring, unaware. The wind tugged at his coat, cold and insistent. He knew, even before the thought formed, That the storm had not truly passed, it had only changed its shape. Elias straightened and looked toward the distant hills, his jaw set. He'd given her a night of shelter, a name spoken with care, a moment of safety. Now the world would come to take it all away, emotional tone and realization, shared vulnerability under the storm's roar. The night becomes a mirror of grief and healing. In the crack of thunder, fear turns to fragile trust, two broken souls finding in each other the faint pulse of something human again. The storm had passed, but its ghost lingered in the valley. Days turned long and pale, the air heavy with the smell of damp earth. The fields glistened with puddles where sunlight caught, and from the cabin roof, water still dripped like a ticking clock. Elias Carter rose with the dawn, as always, to tend to the horses and check the fence lines. He no longer worked in silence. There was always another presence now, a soft rhythm of footsteps behind him. A second pair of hands at work. Nayeli had found her place without being told. She chopped wood with a calm, methodical strength, her movements sure though her palms were raw. She fed the chickens and milked the goat that Elias had nearly forgotten to care for. Sometimes she hummed under her breath low, ancient melodies that drifted through the cabin like smoke. He never asked her what the songs meant, but the sounds steadied him in a way he could not explain. By the week's end, the two of them had fallen into a rhythm. Elias mended the fences and worked the small patch of earth behind the cabin. Nayeli swept the floors, washed clothes in the basin, and cooked simple meals. She used the herbs that grew by the riverbank, blending them with salt and fire in ways that turned his plain food into something alive again. Still, tension sat between them, silent, taut, always there. Elias felt it in the way he hesitated before speaking her name. In the quick glance he gave the road each time he heard a distant hoofbeat. Out here, secrets never stayed hidden long when he rode into town for supplies. The storekeeper, old Marin, eyed him the way folks did when they smelled gossip. "Heard there's been strangers up your way," Marin said, weighing flour on his scale. "Someone said they saw smoke from your chimney when the storm hit. You get company, Carter?" Elias kept his face blank. "Coyotes," he said. "Been hanging around the ridge again." Marin snorted. "Coyotes don't light fires." Elias said nothing more. He took his supplies and rode out before the man could press further. The ride home felt longer than usual, the weight of suspicion trailing him like dust. When he reached the cabin, Nayeli was outside, hanging washed clothes across the line. The sight hit him with a strange tenderness, the white shirt, the shawl, her dark hair moving in the wind. She looked up at him, and for a fleeting moment he thought how natural it all seemed, how it could almost be a home again. But then the thought curdled with guilt. The next morning, he saw riders on the horizon, neighbors passing through, maybe heading toward the creek. He knew better than to take chances. He turned to Nayeli, who was mending one of his shirts near the hearth. "Go below," he said quietly, nodding toward the trapdoor that led to the root cellar. She looked up, confused. "Why? Someone's coming," he said. "Just for a bit. I'll call you when they're gone." Her brow furrowed. "Hide?" Elias avoided her eyes. "Just until they pass." For a moment she didn't move. Then, without a word, she rose and descended into the dim cellar. The wooden door shut softly behind her. A few minutes later, two neighbors rode up, Bill Harker and young Amos. They greeted Elias with nods, asked about the storm, the fences, the usual chatter. But Elias felt sweat bead at his temples. He could feel the faint hum of life beneath the floorboards, the quiet sound of Nayeli breathing in the dark. After they left, he opened the trapdoor. Nayeli climbed out, her eyes unreadable. She said nothing the rest of the day. That night after supper the air hung heavy with unspoken words. The fire burned low. Nayeli sat by the hearth, hands clasped, her gaze fixed on the flames. Elias sat across the room, pretending to mend a saddle strap, though his fingers fumbled the work. Finally, she spoke. Her voice was calm, but it carried a weight that made him look up. "Why you hide me?" He stared at her. The question was simple, but it struck deep. "I didn't want trouble," he said slowly. Her dark eyes lifted to his. "Trouble for who?" He opened his mouth, but the words wouldn't come. Because he knew the truth. He'd hidden her not just from the world, but from himself, from what her presence made him feel, from the line he feared crossing. Nellie's gaze didn't waver. "You shame?" she asked. He felt the heat rise in his face. "No," he said too quickly. Her voice softened. "You fear them." "Not me." Elias looked down at his hands, at the rough calluses, the dirt that never washed away. He thought of Mary, how he'd once stood beside her in church, proud and unafraid. And now here he was, lying to keep alive a fragile mercy that shouldn't have needed hiding. He stopped, swallowed. "I don't want you hurt." Nayeli studied him a long time, then nodded slowly, though her eyes dimmed. She turned back to the fire. "Hurt already," she said quietly. The silence that followed stretched thin as wire. The fire crackled, a log splitting in two. Outside, the coyotes called to the moon. Later, when she slept, Elias stepped out onto the porch. The night was cold and clear, the stars sharp enough to cut. He sat in his old chair, rifle resting across his knees, and stared into the dark fields. Guilt twisted inside him. The kind that had no name. He wanted to protect her from the men who'd call her savage, from the soldiers who'd hunt her, from the loneliness that had driven him hollow. But there was another truth he couldn't deny. Part of him wanted her near for his own sake. Her voice, her presence, the faint sound of her breathing at night, they had become the pulse of a life he thought long gone. He hated himself for it. He feared it. The wind rose, rustling the dry grass. Elias tightened his grip on the rifle and listened to the sound of the night, the coyotes. The creak, the faint creak of the roof beams above her sleeping form. Somewhere deep inside he knew the quiet couldn't last. Still, he sat there until the horizon began to pale. The rifle cold against his knees, a man caught between duty and desire. Between shame and salvation, emotional tone and realization. Uneasy intimacy thickens beneath the silence. Elias's fear of judgment collides with his longing to protect and to possess. Compassion and attachment blur into one, leaving him adrift between the man he was and the man he is becoming. Evening settled over the valley like a slow exhale. The sky burned orange, then turned the color of bruised steel. Elias Carter sat on the porch, sharpening his knife, his gaze wandering to the horizon where the sun died behind the ridge. The air carried the scent of rain that hadn't yet fallen, restless and heavy. Inside the cabin, Nayeli moved quietly, humming the same low tune she had sung the night before. He didn't know the words, but it soothed something in him that had long been starved of peace. It was nearly dark when the riders came. 4 of them, their horses kicking up dust as they neared the cabin. Elias saw the glint of rifles before he heard their voices, rough, sharp, laced with liquor and suspicion. His gut tightened. He knew that sound too well. Men with a thirst for trouble. He rose from his chair, the knife still in his hand, and called through the open door. "Stay inside." Nayeli froze where she stood, the shadows swallowing her expression. The riders dismounted, boots crunching in the gravel. Their leader, a man named Boyd Halpern Elias, remembered him from town, spat into the dirt and said, "Evening, Carter. Didn't expect to see smoke from your place this late." Elias leaned against the post, careful to look calm. "Cold nights lately. Fire keeps the chill off." Boyd's eyes narrowed. "That so? Folks in town been talking. Said someone saw an Apache woman around these parts. One of ours got his wagon robbed on the south road. You seen anything?" Elias shook his head. "Ain't seen anyone but coyotes and wind." Another rider, young and mean-eyed, chuckled. "Coyotes don't steal blankets, old man." Elias didn't move. His rifle leaned against the wall just behind him, close enough to reach but too far to show fear. "You're wasting daylight," he said. Boyd's smile turned thin. "We'll decide what we're wasting." He took a step toward the door. "Mind if we look around?" Elias stepped in his way. "I do mind." The air went still. The only sound was the horses shifting their weight and the creak of Boyd's saddle. The men exchanged glances, drunk, eager, stupid. "Now why's that?" Boyd asked softly. "You hiding something, Carter?" Elias felt the sweat run down his back. His heart thudded slow but heavy. He had hidden her before from gossip. This was different. This was the kind of danger that ended in blood. He kept his voice steady. Ain't hiding a thing. Just don't like men sniffing through my house like dogs. Boyd's expression hardened. Step aside. When Elias didn't move, Boyd reached for him. The hand barely touched Elias's shoulder before instinct took over. Elias shoved him back, hard enough to make the man stumble. The others reacted instantly, shouting, reaching for weapons. A struggle flared in the dusk like lightning. Elias grabbed his rifle, the motion fluid from a lifetime of habit. Don't! He barked, but one of the men already had his gun drawn. The flash came first, then the sound, a deafening crack that split the silence. The bullet tore through the doorframe. Reflex, not thought, guided Elias's aim. He fired once. The man who'd shot at him staggered backward and fell into the dust. His rifle clattering from his hands, the world went still again except for the ringing in his ears. Boyd froze, his face pale in the twilight. The other two riders hesitated, their courage leaking out with the smoke. From inside the cabin came the sound of footsteps, light, quick. Nayeli stepped into the doorway, her shawl around her shoulders. Eyes fierce and bright, the moment she appeared, the men's faces changed from aggression to something meaner, hatred. Well, I'll be damned, one muttered. He's hiding her. Elias moved in front of her without thinking, his rifle steady now. You best ride home, he said quietly. Ain't nothing here for you. For a long second, no one moved. Then Boyd spat again, backing toward his horse. You'll regret this, Carter. You just killed a man to save a thief. They'll all come for you. Elias didn't answer. He just kept the rifle raised until the three men mounted up and rode off into the darkness, their curses fading into the wind. When they were gone, the silence returned, but it was a broken silence, heavy with what could not be undone. The dead man lay sprawled near the steps, the dust around him turning dark with blood. Nayeli knelt beside him. She closed his eyes with a tenderness that startled Elias. He would kill you, she said softly. Elias swallowed hard. I know. They dragged the body out toward the ridge and covered it with stones. The coyotes would come by morning, but by then, the land would have already started reclaiming what was taken. When they returned to the cabin, the air inside still smelled of gunpowder and smoke. The fire had burned low, casting the room in trembling light. Elias sat at the table, his hands shaking. Nayeli poured water from the basin, dipped a cloth, and cleaned the blood from his sleeve. Neither spoke for a long while. Outside, the wind moaned across the plain. At last, Elias said, They'll bring lawmen. Maybe soldiers. Nayeli's gaze didn't falter. Then we go. He nodded, though his throat felt tight. We'll ride north. Before dawn. She hesitated, then reached out and touched his hand. Her fingers were small, warm against his rough skin. You save me, she whispered. He looked at her, the fire reflecting in her dark eyes. No, he said quietly. You saved what was left of me. The words hung between them like a confession. Nayeli didn't reply. She simply laid her hand over his heart for a brief, trembling moment, then withdrew. Later, when she slept, Elias sat by the dying fire. He stared at his hands, the same hands that had built fences, buried his wife, and now taken a man's life. The rifle leaned beside him, still smelling of smoke. He felt no pride, no victory. Only a strange, aching clarity. For the first time in years, he understood what it meant to care enough to fight. The act had not been born of hate. It had come from something deeper, something clean and fierce as a flame. Outside, the stars burned cold and bright, and the coyotes began to howl. Inside, the fire between them glowed low but alive, its warmth reaching the corners of the cabin. The corners of their hearts, emotional tone and realization, protective fire ignites. Violence born not from hate but from the desperate need to protect what little good remains in a ruined world. Elias's act of defense becomes his reckoning, a moment where love, guilt, and courage blur into one truth. Survival has meaning only when it is shared. The weeks that followed blurred into a long stretch of silence. The snow that had dusted the high ridge melted into muddy streams, and spring crept back across the valley in cautious steps. The air smelled of sage and thawed earth again. But for Elias Carter, the thaw brought no ease, only the waiting. He'd buried the blood-stained boards behind the barn, scrubbed the rifle clean, and mended the door. Yet no amount of work could quiet the echo of that night. Every hoofbeat in the distance made him pause, every dust trail on the horizon turned his stomach cold. He knew they would come. When they finally did, the morning was clear. 3 riders, wearing long coats and iron stars pinned to their chests, appeared along the road from town. Lawmen. Elias watched them from the porch, coffee cooling in his hand. He didn't run. He didn't reach for the rifle. He just waited, like a man who'd already stood trial in his own heart. The lead rider, a broad-shouldered man with gray and his beard, dismounted first. "Elias Carter?" he asked. Elias nodded. Double quote inside. He gestured toward the cabin. "You can talk anywhere you like?" They stepped up to the porch. The officer removed his hat. "Name's Marshal Denton. We found a man dead down by the river 2 days south. Folks in town say you had trouble with a few settlers? One of them's missing." Elias met the marshal's eyes. "He came here drunk and armed. Tried to force his way in. I warned him off." The marshal studied him, eyes narrowing. "You shoot him?" Elias didn't flinch. "Yes," the word hung there, bare and heavy. Nayeli stood in the doorway behind him, silent, her shawl drawn close. The younger deputy shifted uneasily. "There was talk you were harboring an Apache woman." Elias turned his head slightly. "She was starving. I gave her shelter. That's all." The marshal looked between them, then sighed. "Town split on what to do. Some say you did right. Others want blood for blood." Elias didn't answer. The truth, as always, was simpler than people wanted it to be. The marshal rubbed his jaw. "I seen enough killing in my time to know the kind that's righteous from the kind that ain't. You ain't the latter." He glanced back at his men. "But I've still got to take your statement. You'll ride with us to town, tell your piece, and we'll let the law decide." Elias nodded slowly. "I'll come." They stayed the night at his cabin, too late to ride back. Nayeli cooked a thin stew from what they had, and the lawmen ate in awkward quiet. Elias said little. The marshal, perhaps out of mercy, didn't press questions until morning. When dawn came, Elias stood by the stable, saddling his horse. Nayeli stepped beside him, her hands trembling as she tied her shawl. "You go," she said. "They take you?" He smiled faintly, though it was tired and hollow. "Maybe, maybe not." Her eyes searched his face, then lowered. "If they do, I wait." He looked at her, then the woman who'd appeared half dead at his door, who breathed life back into the silence he'd called living. "No," he said softly. "Don't wait for me. Whatever happens, you keep going. The world's still wide enough for us both." By midday, they reached town. The hearing was short. The marshal spoke for him, and so did old Marin, the storekeeper, who admitted he'd heard talk of those men drinking and boasting about teaching Carter a lesson. Even the preacher's wife came forward, saying she'd known Elias for years, that he wasn't one for cruelty. When the day ended, the verdict was quiet. "Self-defense," the marshal said. "You'll walk free." But Elias didn't feel free, not in any way that mattered. He thanked the marshal, mounted his horse, and rode out of town. Nayeli was waiting where the river bent, her horse grazing by the water. She didn't ask how it had gone. She didn't need to. She saw it in his eyes, the weary kind of peace that only comes after standing before judgment and finding mercy. They rode together for 2 days, following the creek north. The land opened wider the farther they went, the sagebrush giving way to rolling hills. They spoke little, their silence a language of its own. On the 3rd morning they reached the valley's edge. Beyond it, the mountains rose sharp and pale against the sky. Nayeli stopped her horse and turned to him. "This where I go," she said quietly. He dismounted. The wind tugged at his coat, stirring dust between them. "You sure?" She nodded. "My people north. Maybe still there. Maybe not. But I go." He swallowed, the words catching in his throat. "You'll be safe?" A faint smile touched her lips. "Safe nowhere. But maybe home." Elias didn't try to stop her. He knew better than to chain a soul that had already broken free once. Instead, he walked to his saddle and unfastened the rifle that had never left his side since that night. It was clean now, polished, the leather strap smooth from his hand. Nayeli watched him quietly, then stepped closer. She reached up, unbraided one slender strand of her dark hair, and tied it to the rifle strap. Her fingers moved slow, deliberate. "So you remember," she said. He looked at the strand black against the worn brown leather and felt something inside him settle, like dust after a storm. "I will." She held his gaze one last time. Then she turned and began walking north. Her shawl fluttering like a small flame in the wind, Elias stood and watched until she disappeared over the rise. He didn't call out. There were no words left that hadn't already been said in the silence they'd shared. When he finally turned back toward home, the valley stretched before him, gold and quiet beneath the setting sun. The world felt both emptier and fuller all at once. He rode slow, the sound of the wind whispering through the sagebrush, carrying her name, her voice, the faint rhythm of her song. By the time the cabin came into view, twilight had fallen. The firelight glowed faintly through the window, steady and small. Elias dismounted, walked inside, and set his rifle by the hearth. The braid of her hair brushed against his fingers as he did, and for the first time in years he smiled. He poured himself coffee, sat in his old rocking chair, and listened to the fire crackle. Outside, the stars climbed high above the plain. He felt no regret, no sorrow, only peace. Sometimes mercy doesn't come in the saving. Sometimes it comes in the letting go, emotional tone and realization, bittersweet closure. The fire has cooled to ash, but its warmth remains. Justice bends toward mercy and love toward freedom. In letting her go, Elias rediscovers his own dignity, a quiet redemption that needs no witness.